What is up, guys? Welcome to another episode of the Assemble Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Justin Jones. Whether I'm hitting the trails, training for an ultramarathon, or pushing my limits in the gym strength training, I've always been fascinated by what drives us to perform at our best. This podcast is for everyone, from the serious endurance, strength, or hybrid athlete to the outdoor enthusiast who wants to live life to the fullest. I believe that peak performance is an assembly of physical training, mental fortitude, emotional health, and social support. Whether you're training for a sport or viewing life itself as the ultimate athletic event, join me in redefining limits and living a life full of challenges and adventure. Let's get into today's podcast. What's up, guys? We got Chris Soto back on the podcast. Chris was on a few weeks ago with Joe, and we talked about all things tactical training. And then towards the end of that podcast, we started to talk about mileage and get into some more specific running things. So we thought we'd come back on and take a step back and introduce cardio, running, and kind of bridge the gap from the beginning to where we kind of picked up in that podcast. So Chris, how's it going?
It's going well. We were just chatting about how difficult burpees can be.
Yes. Oh man. Yeah. Burpees are no fun. So you just started coaching in person a few weeks ago, right? Coaching some Gen
Yes.
Pop.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's why we're talking about burpees, because they had burpees in one of their workouts that Chris jumped in on.
Yeah. Didn't have to. I'm coaching the class. I don't have to jump in, but
You don't have to, but it looks better,
decided
right?
to. Yeah.
So when talking about running, I wanted to take a step back and talk about cardio first. And
Mm.
I actually originally wanted to talk about running first, but it was your suggestion to talk about maybe Gen Pop first, which makes more sense. So in a general population focus, if we would take a step back to just cardio, my first question was going to be like, where do you see cardio? Like, what's the point of cardio for a general population person that just comes in and wants to be fit?
Yeah. So lately I've been thinking about training as having different sorts of tiers, right? And the reason that I suggested we could start with Gen Pop is that that's kind of like a beginning entry point for a lot of people is, they'll jump on a treadmill or a bike or whatever. And I suppose it's helpful to think of athletes as fitting into one of these tiers, right? So the way I've been looking at it lately is somebody, the thing that I keep saying is that context matters immensely, and is bringing something different to the table. So you could be training for enjoyment, you could be training for health, and then you could be training for performance. And I think that's a pretty good way to differentiate between who you're talking about, right? And then people might sit in between each of those things to wildly varying degrees. For the Gen Pop, it seems like they may not be training every day, right? If they're training for enjoyment or health, it might just be like a thing they do here and there, a weekend warriors, but type of thing. And so if you're not necessarily training every day, what that might look like is, depending on who you are, a really long, slow walk, right, is enough to elicit some significant aerobic adaptations for somebody. If they're mostly or completely sedentary, that's a very good entry point for them, right? And that could be 20 minutes at first, 30 minutes at first. Walking is often cited as almost like, we talk a lot about like hacks and magic bullets and how there are none. But for mostly sedentary population, general population, that is one, right? You just get out and you move more. But as someone becomes a little fitter, that might change into something that requires a little more intensity. And depending on who it is, it may look a little more like a spin class or some sort of, people like to go do with like nice hard intervals on a bike, on an assault bike or something like that. But for people kind of in those tiers training for enjoyment or health, it isn't usually very organized, right? And they're just going in and they're puffing and puffing, they feel good, and that's it, right? But if you wanted to move beyond that a little bit and organize your training in a way that you could show some progression across a training block or just across time. It may be helpful to kind of think of cardio as like you organize it with a couple different intensities, right? Depending on what your schedule is. Again, I know I'm saying depending a lot. That's probably the coach's favorite thing to say. It depends, but it truly does. Not everybody, for example, is going to want to or will end up adhering to something like the WHO's guidelines for physical activity for adults, right? Which comes out to like 30 minutes, 5 days out of the week, 150, so that's 150 minutes of moderate aerobic activity. And that could be anywhere from zone 1 to 3, right? Depending on who it is. That's a very fine guideline. I think could be useful for a lot of people to kind of work up to that. And if they can get that in on a consistent basis, that's awesome. But if you don't have the time necessarily to be doing something like that, then you could look to some more intense options. And funny enough, the WHO has kind of a concurrent guideline with that, which is 75 minutes vigorous aerobic activity. And that could look like, in 3 days of 20 minutes of hard intensity intervals, or just being in a high zone 3 or zone 4, zone 5 for those who are able to, right? Not everybody has access to that sort of, it's hard to go hard, right? For some people. So in a general population context, you might organize your training in just like from an output based perspective, right? So if you put on a clock, we're going to get on this bike and go hard for a minute, right? And then you rest for however much you need to recover for the next interval. You take an average of what that output is, whether that's, wattage or how much distance you're covering. You track that across time. If you hold the same level of effort, for example, across a month, and your output goes up, we know you've gotten fitter, right? Or if you hold the same level of output and your RPE comes down, your perceived effort comes down, we also know that you've gotten fitter. And so that's just kind of like a simple way for somebody who's not necessarily looking to, hey, like I want to run, a 5K time on this date. I'm going to be doing like a really big 20-week block for it. General population generally isn't concerned with something like that, right? But a very simple way to see if you've progressed is just like how I laid out with outputs and RPE. If those improve, something's happening, right? You're making good adaptation. And if somebody wants to do zone 2 work a couple times out of the week, a way to track that is just it's the same thing, right? Put 40 minutes, you're going to go do zone 2 jogging or incline treadmill walking or biking. And your current effort is RPE, let's say 3 or 4, right? It's not quite super easy, but you're working a little bit and you're able to cover this amount of distance. Over time, if your level of RPE comes down for this 40-minute easy conditioning work, then we know you've gotten fitter. Or if you're able to increase the amount of distance, but your RPE is the same, we know you've gotten fitter. That's just like a little scheme that I think could be useful for a lot of people. Instead of trying to like, hey, I'm going to increase my VO2 max by, so many points. That's certainly a way to gauge aerobic fitness, but not everybody is super into the high intensity interval training, whether that's on a bike or running, Yeah, that's just like a thought that I had. That's kind of like this entry point, this first year of fitness as I've been organizing it within my training model. I'm rewriting my training model. So that's something that's been on my mind a lot. That's the vast majority of people that we probably would be working with, right? Not everyone is training for performance. Not everyone cares about how fast they are or how long they can run, right? It's purely for the benefits of health and purely for whether or not they enjoy it.
Yeah, my wife actually just started going to spin class with a friend on the weekends.
Yeah.
They got a lot of energy in the mornings, but they my wife doesn't, but the instructors do obviously. But they track,
Yeah.
I
I
think they
was about to
track
say,
wattage and mileage on they have a like app that she can look at all of her progress. So that's cool. She has
mhm,
fun. It's all
totally.
pretty high intensity. But for a lot of people, when they go into the gym, they just want to be healthier. I when I think of like what people see online and the people I talk to that are more Gen Pop, they don't really know what it means. They're like, I just want to be healthier, and they don't really know what that means. They just know what they see other people doing and what feels good to them. And a lot of people will start off with a ton of motivation, but without kind of learning a little bit of the background as to why I'm doing what I'm doing, they
Sure.
have a hard time keeping with it. So why, for those people, like why does cardio even fit in a protocol for somebody that just wants to be healthy? If that makes sense. Like
Yeah.
we
Well,
take this stuff for granted because we understand it,
sure.
but a lot of people don't.
Yeah, definitely. It's really just to improve risk factors for cardiovascular disease, in my opinion. If you're talking purely from like a health perspective, it's certainly beneficial for those who are training for performance to have, increased utilization of fat, or, you're training the oxidative pathway to be more efficient. For those training for performance, it kind of builds that foundation. A lot of people like to use the word base, an aerobic base, so that you can put to use later for more intense workouts, right? So training general cardio will help in lifting, for example, your ability to recover between sets and your ability to recover between workouts, right? So if a Gen Pop needed some background as to why the hell they're doing anything, right, when it comes to like easy conditioning work, that's what's going on. But you're just improving your ability to be more efficient with your cardiovascular system, right? And over time, you may get to a point where a Gen Pop may get to a point where they feel like they maybe want to increase their intensity a little bit, and they'll find that it's not as hard as it used to be, right? Like if you're mostly sedentary or completely sedentary, you walk into a gym environment and you don't know what you're doing, and man, I'm just gonna get on the rower, and somebody mentioned I should try to see what my 1,000 meter time is, right, on a rower. Somebody did this last night at the gym, and they go too hot out the gate. They're in a puddle of their own sweat afterwards. They can't move for a few minutes, and it may take them a few days to come back and like try it again. Well, it's not exactly what I would have somebody do on day one, right? Intensity is certainly important, something that you should sprinkle in if you're training for enjoyment or health. But as you get fitter, like you can do that. And if you have this easy aerobic base, this easy conditioning / aerobic base to support all that, yeah, that could be a really, really good idea. You probably have a better time when you finally decide to add some intensity to your training.
But Chris, I want to be healthy, but I want to look good. And if I run, I'm going to look skinny, right? I'm not going to look muscular like all my favorite people.
Man, you put a there today.
I mean, maybe just from a Gen Pop perspective, it doesn't have to be from a super high level athlete perspective, but a lot of people do still think that. They think, I want to look super muscular, and they see these elite runners that all are very skinny because they're elite runners. And so
Yeah,
it just gets bridged like, okay, if I do too much cardio, I'm going to be super skinny and not
sure.
muscular, I guess.
That the mm, topic of aesthetics comes purely down to like how you eat, right? And that's also not necessarily somewhere I would start with somebody unless they really wanted to, unless it was important to them, unless maybe if they are training for health and they have a bit of excess adipose tissue. Sure, yeah, we can talk about how that works from body composition perspective. But by and large, if on the one hand, if they're training purely for enjoyment and health, it's not a super huge concern. I'm happier that somebody is getting in movement and, working their aerobic system, whether that's purely easy conditioning or, some sort of high intensity steam that we decide on. I think as I look at it right now, if somebody does want to improve their body composition to a pretty high degree, or like, hey, and all of the flags are green for, the person's doing it for the right reasons. They're really into it. They're ready to commit to something like that. It's very hard. Yes, that I think that would fall into the category of training for performance from to some degree. I don't know if you would agree with me there. 'Cause
Yeah.
that does take like, hey, there's going to be a timeline. There's going to be, this kind of stepwise progression of decreasing calories, and hopefully they do it in such a way that they're still able to perform well in their workouts, and setting a realistic goal for them to hit, right? So if it's 20 pounds in 12 weeks, which is, I think, is like the higher limit of what Renaissance periodization prescribes, like with their RP diet coach app, that's really hard. That's going to take, 90+% adherence to all of your meals and all that. But if it's a lesser sort of weight loss goal, because that's what we're talking about, right? You lose fat, you're going to lose mass, and 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 you'll certainly look better at the end of it. But it would be easier to do something like 8 to 10 pounds, in 12 weeks. That's kind of like this slow and steady, easy entry point. But I guess the question that you posed was like, hey, I'm going to look like just really skinny elite, like Kipchoge or something. Something. I don't think that would be the case for a lot of people, depending on who you are. And it certainly would not be the case if you were including resistance training in what you do for workouts. So, which they should be doing anyway, in my opinion.
Definitely. So when it comes to the body composition, we don't have to talk on this too long, but I'd be interested to hear what you think, because I would say if somebody comes in and again, all the flags are green and they're like, I want to, cut this body fat, I would call that a performance
Mhm.
goal. But you do have a good amount of people that come in and they're kind of in a more of a reactive state. Maybe their doctor was like, hey, if you continue down this path, you might,
Uh,
become diabetic, insulin resistant. Maybe, so they're a little bit more reactive. And I'd be
mhm.
interested to hear what you think, because in my mind, you've got two things. You've got moving away from pain and then moving towards something. And so when you get those people, you as the coach can, provide them the framework to lose the body fat. But I think mentally
Sure.
for them, it's a lot better to give them a goal to work towards. So I give them homework and it's like, hey, find something that you want to work towards, whether it's, hey, I want to pick up this amount of weight. I want to walk this 5K. I want to, whatever you want to do, but something to work towards. And then like, as long as you follow the plan and work towards that, I'll make sure that the health mark, like you're losing the body fat and working, away from the bad thing. But I want to get
Mhm.
your brain focused on a good thing in the future. So you're not just walking around every day scared and feeling restricted from this bad thing behind you.
I think I would agree. I think process oriented goals is easier for somebody to wrap their head around than like, I want to do this thing 12, 16 weeks from now, or I want to look a certain way 12 to 16 weeks from now, or run a certain time, or pick whatever. If you keep somebody's mind on today's workout and today's meals, right? The thing that we've heard all the time about for people training for selection is that, it's very helpful to live meal to meal. I think that's an excellent way to kind of think about segmenting this very, very long training block that you're going to go through to achieve XYZ goal. Whether that's somebody who's, like you said, like coming to a strength conditioning professional in a reactive way, like my doctor said this, and I need to work on this, right? Whether you have that person or somebody who's just like ready for something like that, I think keeping their mind on today now is extremely useful. Otherwise, it gets to be too much, right? You can't eat an elephant all at once. So, right. So one bite at a time. I agree.
So now we've got maybe some Gen Pop that have been training for a while and they want to do a dedicated event. Maybe it's a, running race, right? That's
Mhm.
very popular. Or you have somebody who's run for sport and they've been running for a long time. And so that's just their world. And then I think the third type of person you have in this category of like running or training for performance specifically, and not just for health, is
Mhm.
you have a lot of people that haven't run before and they, get inspired some way, a book, a YouTube video, a documentary, and they
Sure.
just want to jump right past the, kind of gradual, I'm training for health now, I'm training for this as a sport. And they just want to go right in. That's, couch to 5K. They even have, I think, couch to marathon programs I've seen, which is, quite the jump. But you've got kind of these three different types of people that are then training for running as performance based.
Mhm.
So, can we kind of talk about that gradual progression from health to running first and how training changes in that instance?
Sure. In my head, I think last week we had talked a little bit about this. I have this paradigm in my head where, a little bit of fitness will allow you to put in a little bit more volume, and that increase in volume will help increase your fitness, and that increase in fitness will help you put in more, right? So you build on your capacity to put in more work that you can recover from. And that's a really good gateway or scheme to use for, bridging this. Hey, I'm just over here hobby jogging to, hey, I'm going to do this. I'm going to qualify for Boston, for example, something like that. And it'll take a while, certainly, because now you have to think about setting up a training, a season of training, right? And those have their own sorts of progressions and schemes. Somebody could just be running, like just running easy pace or, VT1 zone 2 pace and improve very, very well just doing that. I actually think David Goggins did that, right? When he was just running. I don't know that he does any speed work. I don't know. I've never heard him talk about like, you know, tempo runs or intervals or anything like that. He just goes out and run. And that could be certainly a method for people to use. But as you get a little more specific from, hey, I just want to finish a race, which honestly is pretty easy to do with some work. Finishing a distance just requires that you go slow enough. And if you're, in a place where you're ready to do that, like you're not overly encumbered by fat mass, you're even just decently athletic and you're able to recover from the volume that you're putting in, you can go do that, right? You can go do a half marathon and just see what your time is or just complete the distance. As you transition more from just finishing to, hey, I want to be faster. Well, now you have to add certain intensities. And it's always helpful to have a coach guide you through this. You have to add certain intensities like threshold or VO2 intervals or fast, short distance reps on a track or within a fartlek. There's all of these different types of workouts that are going to support your ability to or increase your fitness to be able to finish a race faster than what you did before, or so that you can get closer to a time that you're trying to run. And that needs to be set up in a way that a person will adhere to, needs to be set up in a way that, hey, this person can recover from these workouts. It may mean, it may not mean that all of your training volume is only going to be running, right? That's what cross training is for. Is if you get to a point where, hey, 30 miles, I'm good. 40, I'm kind of hurting and I can't really, I'm having trouble sleeping. You're on the verge of non-functional overreaching or even overtraining, well, you can add in more aerobic volume on a bike or a rower or just walking if you put the incline on the treadmill high enough, right? Or you have somebody who is ready to ready to put all of their training volume in solely with just running, and some people kind of get to that point on their own without the help of a coach. But certainly, I guess my point is you will need to do some more intense work if you are trying to get faster, right? So if you've never touched a certain pace before, it's like you're not gonna be able to do it, right? I can't remember what Greek philosopher said it. I don't know. I heard it on Tim Ferriss' podcast. You don't rise to your level of expectations; you fall to the level of your training. So if you haven't trained for something before at a pace that you want to be hitting for, like if on a certain race, you won't hit it, right? So intensity will matter more as you become more concerned with training for performance.
Yeah, that's why even a lot of the more serious marathon programs will have you do a very long workout. And then towards the end of that workout, some pretty intense speed work after your legs are already very tired. Because again, you don't know what it's like to run that fast at mile 20 if you've never run that fast at
Yeah.
mile 20.
Yeah. That actually didn't occur to me. Yeah. We used to do that all the time in college during the summers. We would do oh, we get assigned like a long run, right? Of however many, let's say 10 miles. And then, but the total for the day is going to be 12. And the last two are just like fast, and it didn't occur to me until very recently that that was like a type of pre-fatigue, which is a concept we use a lot in concurrent training and hybrid training. But yet, yes, yeah, you're going to have to run while tired. And that's one way to teach somebody to maintain mechanics while they're fatigued, or maintain speed while fatigued, or mentally try to keep it together, remain composed under fatigue.
So two things you said that I think are important. One is that you can do some cross training. So I think a lot of people don't realize that, especially at that low intensity, cross training really has a lot of carryover. You don't have to just run. You can cycle or swim or row or insert, very intense
Mhm.
incline treadmill walk.
Mhm.
And it can have a good amount of carryover to running. So you don't just have to run because running has a lot of pounding, running. It's really easy to get injured running in contrast to something like cycling if you aren't
Sure.
ready for the amount of volume that you're doing. So with some of the people that I've worked with that want to do longer races, but they don't have a big running background, we actually do a lot of cycling. And then
Mhm.
as time goes on, actually the overall aerobic volume doesn't change as much, but the cycling volume comes down as the running volume comes up.
Yes. Yes.
So then second though, I want to point out when you're training for running as a specific sport for performance, the progression model. So kind of two things that you can progress. You can either progress volume or intensity, right? So can you
Mhm.
kind of speak about how that progresses over somebody's training plan?
Sure. So like I said earlier, I think increasing a little bit of intensity might be a good place to start, depending on who it is, right? And the reason I say intensity first, though, or the reason I like increasing intensity first is because it will, if you've never done it before, those are beginner gains, right? So you can add a little bit of quality work to somebody's training and they'll improve and recover pretty well if the dose is appropriate. Right? From there, increasing the volume of intensity work. So instead of doing a 3 mile tempo, we might do 3.5 and 4. And then maybe we weight it back down and adjust paces or something like that. That's somewhere I would start first from a progression standpoint. And again, that's just a strategy. Like it could be that somebody responds better to volume, and maybe you want to do more aerobic work introduce cross training to even more of it, and then put in some higher intensity work. And like we said earlier, having this big aerobic base will help the intensity work that you put in, right? You'll be able to recover from it more efficiently. It won't be as you probably won't be as wrecked again if the training dose is appropriate. But I guess it really just depends on who it is we're talking about. Like I said, you might have a volume responder, you know, who doesn't need a ton of speed work, or who doesn't need a ton of interval work like in the VO2 range, or or you might have somebody who responds really, really well to a ton of circa threshold work. I don't know. Are you asking about like specific protocols? Because you could probably do it 100 different ways for somebody, right? And that will vary wildly between even race distances. So I guess it depends.
No, it does. I just wanted to point out that that's how you progress throughout a running program,
Sure.
because I was going to set this up for later when we start to talk about progressing in a concurrent or tactical context.
Hmm. Sure.
But when it comes to running specifically, a lot of people, the quote somebody told me, I can't remember who it was, goes, a lot of people underestimate or overestimate what they can do in the short term and underestimate what they can do in the long term.
Yes.
And so you have a lot of people that get very excited and jump in and they see their favorite people running, 70, 80 miles a week. And they're like, okay, well, I can't do that. I know that. I'm not stupid, but I'll start out, and they'll jump in right at like 30 miles a week, because compared to the people they see, that doesn't seem like a lot, but they haven't ran before. So then they run for a few
Mhm.
weeks. Then they're like, man, I'm getting these injuries. Like it must just be me. I just must not just be cut out for this. I'm just, I can't run. Woe is me. So
Yeah.
how does somebody know where they should be starting out based on kind of their history?
Based on their history, that's okay.
Yeah, it's going to depend a lot on the person, but
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
obviously this is the benefit of working with a coach, because somebody like a coach has done this with a lot of people, so it's a lot more intuitive for you or I to sit down and look at somebody's history and look at their goals and come up with something versus them trying to do it on their own. But not everybody has the finances to have a coach. So if
Sure.
somebody's like, hey, I've tried running and I really don't know where I should start, I've gotten injured, because I've probably done too much, like how do I know where I'm supposed to start?
I think on some level, there's this very spare me 30 seconds to tell a very short story. I don't know what I was doing reading an Eckhart Tolle book at 12 years old. I don't know if you know who Eckhart Tolle is. Yeah. Okay. But there's like this little,
Explain who he is real quick for people that don't know who he is.
he's God, he's a philosopher, kind of, it's definitely like self-help, but like within the context of like spirituality and philosophy. I remember there was a lot of mindfulness in his book, a lot of like meditation type stuff. Really his I think, if I remember correctly, his whole thing was just like being present, like being like, in the now. It was it was on Oprah's list of, like books for that, whatever that year was. But anyway, there's this really short story. It was like one of those like sidebar things between chapters. I've remembered this since I was 12. So there's this monk, like master monk, and his apprentice. They're walking through this like mountain forest, and the apprentice is like trying to like, learn like how to achieve Zen, right? So like whatever we want to call it, enlightenment, nirvana, like same thing, right? But the apprentice is kind of like very doubtful of himself. He doesn't know exactly what to do. He's, oh, geez, how do I do this, right? He stops his master in the middle of this walk. He's like, Master, how do I achieve Zen? Master kind of like looks at him, he like thinks for a second. He's like, close your eyes. Can you hear the stream? And he's like, what? We're in the middle of a forest. There's no stream around. It's like, okay, I'll try. He closes his eyes, like listens very intently for a few moments. He can hear like rushing water, right? As his eyes closed, he's like, man, I hear it. And his master says, enter Zen from there, right? So you're like, oh crap. Like he had this little glimpse of Zen, right? I think there was a word for it. I think it's called Satori or something like that. A glimpse of enlightenment. So they keep walking, and the apprentice starts getting a little like doubtful again. Like he's like, I, how did you, he stops again. He asks his master, how did you like, what would you have said if I hadn't heard the string? And the master like doesn't need to really think about anything. He says, I would have said, enter Zen from there. Right. So it's kind of one of those things where you need to start somewhere. If you have a coach, that starting point will probably be an appropriate dose of volume and intensity or some sort of introductory block. Right. So if you have a coach, that's hopefully what's happening. If you don't, you kind of have to feel out a little bit of like what you're able to do. If you're a beginner runner and, slow jogging paces are still very belabored and, you're in zone 5, like I am right now, then you probably need some sort of other entry point to building up to the ability to run at easy pace, your zone 2 VT1 pace comfortably. Right. And so that's its own progression in itself. If you finally get to that point, maybe you can start introducing intensity and building up from there. But if we're talking about somebody who doesn't know where to start, you kind of just have to start. Right. And that's why assessments are really useful. You and I know the kind of the favorites of CHP, 5-minute aerobic power test for those that are able to handle that, right? VT1 assessment on a treadmill or a bike, depending on who you are. And that'll give you the upper bound of your zone 2. And between those two things, knowing your zone 2 heart rate and pace and your max heart rate number, between those two, you can formulate a little bit. You can create a framework, like you said, where you're able to build intelligent sessions with an intelligent progression model and help somebody understand what those paces are, right? Some people just kind of run out the door. Like if you leave a gate open for a dog, they're just out on the road and they're just like, first 5 minutes feel really good. Of course, they always do. And then crash, right? So helping somebody understand what these intensities feel like is paramount to being able to progress them. I don't know if I made sense. I'm kind of rambling a little bit.
No, that made sense. So
Okay.
for somebody kind of slowly transitioning into the concurrent training, but for somebody who's a power athlete, a strength athlete that wants to start running, whether it's for a tactical reason or just because they want to start running, is the progression similar to somebody who's never done anything before? Or does it look differently because they're already somewhat fit, just in a different domain?
No, I would say it would be pretty similar. And again, assessments will tell you a lot about where that power or strength athlete is at with their conditioning. Usually it's not very high from an aerobic fitness perspective. And in my head, if they're trying to transition to or include more running specifically into their training, they're probably overly encumbered by a lot of muscle mass, especially if they're a high level of strength or power athlete. And so that I don't know that I would treat that any differently from somebody who was overly encumbered by fat mass, right? They're a little overweight. So like I said, the assessments will tell you a lot, and the assessments will help you build a framework for this person, and they will help the athlete understand the intensities that they need to increase their fitness. And at the same time, if we're talking about a strength athlete, or we're a predominantly strength athlete looking to increase their aerobic fitness, it may not be running where you start them. right? Certainly specificity matters. So you might want to have them do, in my head, I think I would have somebody do like, hey, this is what a stride is, you know, it's 20 seconds or 100 meters of some decently fast running. They're going to walk back to the start. We're going to do that 5 to 10 times. That's those ground contacts are important in helping them, you know, learn mechanics, build a little bit of capacity in the lower leg, right? And over time, we do a little bit more of those. Over time, we introduce easy runs. Over time, we introduce run sessions at higher intensities. And like you said, we can decrease the volume of the cross training that we're doing to help support all of that. So no, I don't think it would be dissimilar from like a beginner runner only perspective.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's important to point out too that some people might look at, the David Goggins of the fitness
Mhm.
world and be like, oh, they just kind of jumped right into it and went all out and they were fine. But
That's still true.
really, they weren't really fine. They did get, especially David Goggins mentions how he's gotten hurt a lot, but also those were
Yeah,
gambles that have paid off for them. But you don't know how many people took that gamble and it didn't pay off.
right.
And
Yeah, let's not forget that David Goggins, I think he was trying to get into Badwater for charity, and so he went and did like 100 miles on a track or something like that, right?
yeah, he got like rhabdo, like broke the bones in his feet or
Yeah,
something like that. Yeah.
yeah, and like kidney damage, and I don't know what else. Like, don't do that. That's not that's not what enters then from their machine. Uh, that's not it. That's not it. That's David Goggins, right? Assume you are not David Goggins. Uh,
Yeah. I was just envisioning somebody saying enter Zen from here while they're like, you know, broken feet. Like,
yeah, and he was. I mean, it's lucky for him. I think his wife was like a nurse or something, so like she kind of knew like how to help. I think that was at mile 60 or something like that, mile 70 on a track.
yeah,
But yeah, that's not Zen. Don't do that.
no, I think those stories are useful because a lot of people do self limit and don't, think they can do a lot less than they actually can. But when you get to the
Mhm.
people who are actually going to go out and be like, oh, he did that, so I'm going to go do that, then you have to put the brakes and say, okay, yeah, like was a great story for this, you know, part of the population who's like self limiting right now. That
Yeah,
wasn't for you to go out and also break your legs.
right, right, and that's why coaches are important. I mean, we pull the reins where appropriate, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I work with a good amount of ultra runners and I always have to like pull the reins back a little bit.
Mhm.
I thought about what you said. You used a word when we were on the tactical podcast a lot, when people are very, what word did you use? Neurotic about their training. And that
Yeah,
hit me because, I'm sure you get it all the time because you brought it up too, that people are like, oh, I missed today. And they're all worried about it. When in reality, as the coach, the overall program is set up such that like, if you miss this day, it's not the end of the world.
yeah,
So now moving into the tactical athletes, right? And kind of getting to where we left off on the last podcast. I guess we could probably touch on tactical athletes as a whole and then point out where there's differences between somebody training for selection versus somebody on the job. But with a Gen Pop person, the goal is generally health, enjoyment. And then with a runner specifically, the goal is, hey, I want to do better at this event. So then for a tactical athlete, where does cardio fit into their overall program?
it fits everywhere. I think Weller and Pope, who wrote Building the Elite, explain in their book that if you are training for some sort of tactical occupation, whether that's soft or police or fire, whatever, the goal should be to be a work capacity monster, right? And I think aerobic fitness is just tied into all of that. So how much you can do is determined by how big your base is. And so in some form that needs to be present throughout all of your training, even in strength or power focused in training blocks, and what that might look like is not necessarily running all the time, Although somebody who could handle that, sure, you can do most of your volume. But you can do most of your volume with running. But if you have specific tasks that you need to be better at, like rucking or man, even grinder PT, quote unquote, type stuff, a lot of that is determined by how aerobically fit you are, right? And so you leave a lot on the table if you only do run training to accomplish that. So I would like to see a lot of not super heavy rucking, 20 pounds at somebody's VT1. And same thing, right? It's like you do a little bit of volume and then a little bit of intensity and then a little bit of little bit more volume, right? You can go a long way just following that scheme. With other
So
things like, yeah,
before we get too deep into it, could you explain like work capacity? Because you mentioned a work capacity monster or animal. I can't
yeah,
remember exactly the word you used, but
monster.
what is work capacity?
Work capacity is the ability, well, as Pope and Weller define it, it's your ability to put in X amount of work in Y amount of time, right? So that could look like, for example, 2-minute push-up test, right? That's how much work you're performing in 2 minutes. But you could extend that to also mean like, hey, we have an open-ended workout where we're going to be doing a lot of different things, but 500 4-count lunges plus burpees, man makers, like all of these things. It doesn't take a long time, right? Like you could probably do a bunch of calisthenics in an hour, but the way that you feel while you're doing them, like how heavy you're breathing, how composed you are, it's tied to how aerobically fit you are. So I kind of lost my train of thought. Where were we going with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something I took for granted because I ran from middle school through high school and had a
Hmm.
very good aerobic history. And then when I joined the military, I found a lot of that stuff super easy because of the work capacity I built, at least easier than
Hmm.
some other people. And then after that period, I focused a lot on strength training and not as much on running. And now I'm like, man, I really took for granted
Same.
the the work capacity that I had
Yeah.
because all I could
Yeah.
think about then was, man, I feel so much weaker than all these other people I know. But now I'm
Right.
like, okay, now I'm stronger, but I wish I, still had the work capacity that I had before.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah. And so you just described two different athletes, right? Justin from back then and Justin now, right? But bridging the two kind of is what work capacity is kind of about. And so a kind of a training method that I've been reading up more on and including more in my athletes training is like X intensity continuous training. You could have low intensity continuous training, moderate and high. And all that involves is continually doing some work. If we're talking about LICT, low intensity, that could just involve step ups for 30 seconds and then take a 30-second break, right? Not trying to do them fast. You're just up and down, right? Up and down. And the hope with something like that is that you're able to maintain like a zone two, if you're wearing a chest strap or you're monitoring that. I can't remember who. I remember Kyle Dobbs talking about like a former PJ turned physical therapist who like put up a video on Instagram of him doing like box step ups for 3 by 30 minutes with like 90 pounds in a vest at zone two. Like that's the type of work capacity ability that we're talking about here. Like if you're somebody that's trained for um, a tactical occupation, that's 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 something to shoot for. Being able to do that and not use a ton of your reserve from an aerobic perspective. That's the kind of ability you want to have.
Yeah, that reminds me of
But
the
so
Stairmaster workout. I think some former SEAL posted it on Reddit a while ago. of a 45-pound plate and a Stairmaster, and it was like so many minutes at 12, 13, 14, 15. And
Oh, I
some of
think I've
the
seen that.
yeah, some of the
Yeah,
levels
yeah,
that it has you doing with a 45-pound plate are levels that people would struggle to do at body weight, let alone with like extra
yeah,
weight.
yeah, yeah. And so, and yeah, and so like you do that the first time, you might not even finish, or you'll finish and just be like, what's just like you just been to hell and back, right? So this low intensity continuous training is kind of like a base for being able to do something like that. And you can adjust intensities and pace during a session like that to facilitate more adaptations that'll bring you into higher, the higher intensities, moderate and high. And those protocols will look a little different depending on what you're doing. But that example, like 3 by 30 minutes, box step ups, 90-pound vests in zone 2. That's something to shoot for if you really wanted to ensure that your work capacity was good to go.
So when it comes to tactical athletes, like people preparing for selection, right? They've got a much
Mm,
clearer like goal because they kind of know these are the physical things I have to be able to do. These are the tests I have to be able to pass and things like
mhm.
that. But can we talk about a lot of people in that space probably tend to do too much because they think if I have to run, X amount of miles in a week in selection, then I need to be able to run that or more before because I'm going to be fatigued. When in reality, that's not necessarily the case. And that even comes back to ultra marathon too. Like the race distance doesn't mean you have to have hit that distance before the race, you know? Like for
What's the
instance,
question?
in like so for somebody training for selection, can we speak to
Yeah.
how you train those qualities, but understanding that you don't have to, for instance, in Hell Week, you run, like a couple hundred miles in a week. Like you're not gonna do that in training because you have to do it
Mhm.
in selection. That just isn't something that makes sense.
I've thought a lot about this, obviously, and I think I've kind of included some like new things when we talk about volume. Hey, there's this amount of training volume that you'll do in a selection, and should I be doing that, you know, before I go? And it's like I think every now and again you gotta see what you're capable of in terms like, can I do, for example, what's the David Goggins challenge, that 48 hour?
Oh, the 4x4x48, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Can I do something like that, right now with my current fitness? And maybe that might show you something like that. I'm not saying go do 4x4x48, but something like that might show you where you're at in terms of, of what you're capable of. Or if you went and did like 1,000 burpees, how long did that take you? Did you even finish? What was uh, emotionally? How were you doing during the 1,000 burpees? Or if you're going for a really long ruck, again, how did you do? How much distance did you cover? In what amount of time? What was the weight? How are you feeling from thoughts and feelings perspective? Certainly, you want to see how you're doing in that regard, right? But all of the training that you do needs to put you in a position to be able to do those things, right? I think it's okay to have some short training blocks where you're like, hey, yeah, let's run 50 miles this week and see how you do. Probably be pretty sore. It depends. It's probably all going to be like really easy pace type stuff, right? Because that's how you do it in selection, right? But shuffle, for example. But at that point, I guess the one thing that I've changed my mind on is at that point, because yeah, I'm just talking about phase here, because you're going so slow, right? Famous Bud Shuffle, you're actually very, very inefficient in like when you're running, and you're spending more time on the ground. You have to stay with your group. And at that point, I almost feel like an important part of your training should include some lower leg strengthening, right? A lot of people like the seated calf raise, and the tibialis raises have been very popular lately to kind of help with shin issues and lower leg issues. But I've been turned on to David Gray. I don't know if you follow David Gray Rehab on Instagram. So I have his lower body basics program, and all of that is like foot strengthening and lower limb strengthening, and teaching somebody to build tension in their feet, and and then having somebody bridge that to like co-contractions with the feet and the hamstrings. I think that's something that's missing in a lot of people's training. It's not that they can't put in all of this volume. It's that they structurally they can't handle it, right? Because it's too much from an orthopedic perspective. And you might say, for example, hey, like you can build up to that by doing a lot of mileage and just even increasing linearly, or however you want to do it, whatever progression strategy you want to use. But if somebody's not able to create tension in the right places to produce force in the lower legs, then they're using some other strategy to produce force. And that may not be super optimal for those people, right? So when Jeff Nichols came on the scene, and people were freaking out that there was no running in any of his programs, right? Freaking out. In my head, I remember at the time thinking that just, well, it kind of makes sense. As long as you can move well and produce force well, you can handle whatever sort of run, right? Like, this might be a weird analogy, but me last night in that WOD, right? I hadn't done a full WOD like that in years. And even though I was quote unquote dying, maybe literally dying during the workout, today I don't feel all that bad, right? And that speaks to tissue health and resilience. I'm not walking funny or anything like that. I'm sore in a few places, but overall I'm fine. Whereas for somebody else who maybe did not have as robust tissue quality, they may have you might have strained something. Something might have been hurting from like tendons and ligaments and connective tissue. Kind of like, whoa, this was a lot. If that's taken care of, from like a structural perspective, you could probably put in a lot of volume. And and then the only limiting factor there is how much time do you have to put in all this volume. So I've kind of changed my mind a little bit. I don't think it all needs to look like what selection is going to be, because the most important thing in training for selection is to chase your limiter. But certainly you can have a training block here or there where you're really putting in a lot of volume and trying to see how well you recover. And that might tell you a little bit about maybe some limiters from like a logistical perspective. Are you sleeping enough? Are you eating well enough? Is there something in your recovery that you can improve on? That's valuable in my opinion.
Yeah, for a lot of these tactical athletes who are strong and also move, a lot, the limiter often does come down to just the mechanical stress that your body can handle, not necessarily your
Exactly.
lungs or the strength of your muscles.
Yeah.
So when it
Yeah. You
comes,
just summed up what I said in one sentence.
well, I had another coach
Thank you.
say,
Mechanical stress. Thank you.
I had another coach bring that up to me. So I will not take credit for the term mechanical stress.
Sure.
Another coach brought that up
But
with me, but
that's what I'm talking about is, what you can handle from that perspective will also determine how much volume that you can put in.
so when it comes to running, traditionally you look at kind of overall volume and intensity progressing that. But for a tactical athlete or concurrent athlete, they're also training in the strength domain. So how do you progress? You progress the overall program with that added stress of the strength training and maybe
Mm.
rucking, and you also probably have swimming and cycling, all these other things in there maybe. So how do you look at overall progression of them cardio wise, running wise, with all of that in mind? Because if you just increase mileage like you did with a traditional runner, you might increase things too quickly, put too much mechanical stress on them too fast.
In my head, I would want to, so if it is a limiter, let's say that it is aerobic fitness and they still need some strength work. So let's say that that's one quality that they're chasing in a current block, but they still need to improve on their aerobic fitness. I would probably pick a modality, pick a progression scheme, follow it, and see what improvements are made, if any. Right. So if it's somebody more along the lines of training for SFAS, then it'll probably look more like rucking, and then you can do a block where the easy conditioning is not so much running, it's just easy rucking at BT1 pace. And then the quality work can look something more like you're going to do ruck intervals very, very fast, not ruck running, but like rucking very fast with X amount of rest, with X amount of weight or Y amount of weight. And let's just see what changes are made, right? That's just one scheme that I kind of pulled out of. And from there, if improvements are made, we can switch to something else. Maybe now they need to work on their 2-mile time. We can still use rucking as the easy conditioning part of things, but now transition the quality work more to run intervals or tempo runs or something like that, right? So in my head, it's just like, what's the priority? What are the limiters? It's certainly not all gonna look, like you said, like a runner, like a runner's training. So I would probably cut out a lot of the easy run work, supplement that with something that's a little more relevant to them. So that might be rucking, that might be cycling or whatever, but something that's not as stressful from a mechanical perspective as you stated earlier. Because then they'll still be able to put in all of the other work that they need, like their strength work or capacity stuff. And it also just comes down to like an issue of time. I don't know anybody that could put in, 70 miles a week and, work and have to do family things and, all their other obligations and the strength work and calisthenics and work capacity, like it all kind of comes to, there's definitely, you'll fall over the other side of the curve, right? Like, 'cause this is how much you can handle just logistically in your life. So cutting out the non-essential, the junk is really important from like the aerobic side of things. And you can always supplement it with something else where your time allows.
Yeah, I think it's important to give another example too, which is triathlons. I think we talked about this
Mhm.
before. A triathlon program
Yeah.
doesn't just throw an entire running program in there. It cuts out a lot
Right.
of that easy volume, like you said, because you also have to recover from the cycling and the swimming.
Yeah.
And so those high quality runs are really what you focus on. And it's very similar with concurrent training. You cut out a lot of that, quote unquote junk volume or some of the
Hmm.
less high quality volume in running and focus on those really high quality sessions. That way you can recover overall from the entire training program.
Exactly. And you may end up wanting to, I don't know. I don't know if you've done this in your triathlon training, but like rotating one of those modalities like every so often so that, hey, this week you'll do a long, easy run, but the next week you'll do a long, slow swim, but the next week you'll do a long, slow bike. Is it like that? I think
I'm,
is,
I was gonna say I mostly did it with cycling and running. The swims for me
Mhm.
were mainly an intense swim, a shorter like
Okay.
speed work swim, and
Yeah.
then more of like a recovery swim because running and cycling are both like very lower body heavy, whereas swimming, especially if you just go for an easy swim and maybe you put a pull buoy between your legs, like it can be mainly active recovery at that point. So
Sure.
I was training 7 days a week when I was really heavy triathlon training, and that one day a week was just an easy swim. So I could be recovered. But yeah, it
Yeah.
was a lot of switching up, long cycling one week and then like a long run the next week and then like a brick
Mhm.
workout and kind of rotating through those.
Right.
So we've got the person training for selection. It's very, like we said, very clear cut. I have to hit these times. I have to be able to run this fast, probably somewhat fatigued. But for somebody who's kind of through and now on the job, that endurance component becomes less important as than when they were in selection, right? So what is the role of cardio for somebody who's on the job who, doesn't necessarily have to go out and run a timed 4 mile or, run a 12-mile ruck or something like that?
In my opinion, it looks more like maintenance and higher quality work. So if it's not a priority, I probably want to rotate between focusing on each energy system, kind of like, so like, you know, power and speed. I'd like a lot of sprint work. I think that becomes more important, like when you're on the job. So police officers, pursuits that are going to have to be in the, what, up to 300 meters sometimes, focusing on aerobic work in a little more, how would I say, concentrated way. So it's not always going to be, you know, 60 minutes of zone two work. It's going to be more like, hey, we'll do BTE has their foundation runs, which turn out to be more like zone three intervals with a very, very short recovery in between. So that's a time saver. It's useful for people with shift work, right? Because there's the variability of people's lives just increases once you're on the job, right? You could be on call, you could be not getting a lot of time of sleep. So in my head, I'd want some very focused workouts where we're tracking outputs and seeing what changes there are to those outputs, accommodating for fatigue from lack of sleep or stress. I I think I really like a DUP model, like daily undulating periodization for somebody who's already on the job. Because then you can just move things on the calendar to the right. Right. So you might have some 10 by 10-second sprint intervals with however much rest in between. And we're only talking about conditioning here. Um, and the next day, something a little more glycolytic in the 30 to 90-second range. So that could be 200-meter intervals, pretty fast with the appropriate rest. And then an aerobic day where it's longer, sustained, or if it needs to be a shorter session, but you still want to get some good aerobic work in, it might be a higher intensity zone four threshold type of session. But if somebody is kind of feeling overly stressed or fatigued from their day to day work, or they just came back from a week in the field or something like that, I think in my head I would do this for any athlete. Actually, I would always revert to an easy aerobic day, 20 to 30 minutes, just to get some nutrient flow and help jumpstart recovery process, and then go from there, kind of build back up if there was some sort of detraining. Yeah, I really like the DUP model for people who are on the job, because then you don't have to stick to a rigid schedule that may be a little different for somebody who is active duty, but also has performance goals. Maybe they like racing, here and there or something like that. But if they're not, that's definitely what I would be doing.
I think it's probably also important to mention that for somebody on the job, it's important to find modalities that elicit the adaptations you want, but also that they enjoy and helps them relieve some of that stress. Because for a lot of people, exercise is a stress reliever and it's a
Totally.
very healthy outlet in that, when you think of the alternatives that you could relieve stress with. So,
Well, that goes for anyone too, though, right? Like, don't go to a gym you don't like. Don't be doing stuff you don't like. If you're not training for performance, don't, don't go to, if you hate spin class, don't go.
and even if you're
Find some,
training for
find some,
performance, like it all has to be for something you enjoy. If you hate the training but enjoy the outcome, that's a personal decision to make. Like, is all this training worth it for the outcome I enjoy? But if you hate the
Mm,
training, you hate the outcome, and you're just doing it because somebody said you should, or you feel like you should,
yeah,
probably do something else.
exactly. Exactly. I care more. I care more that people are just putting in their exercise and their movement.
Yeah, I mean, as long as you're doing something, like, the point is to have fun. Like, what's the point if you're not enjoying it?
Yeah.
So was there anything else on tactical athletes that you wanted to talk about or bring up?
No, not off the top of my head.
I think a lot of the discussions are super nuanced, and so you can get very in depth. A lot of the questions that might be brought
Hmm.
up and could probably take an entire podcast to talk about one thing. You know,
Totally.
it depends and all that. I think I've seen 3 or 4 different coaches now say that they're going to start selling "it depends" shirts, like, as a joke. I don't think anybody has, but because it gets talked about so much,
Yeah.
it's like the answer to everything.
Actually, didn't CHP do a sweatshirt?
I don't know. I know
I
Omnia
think I
talked
bought
about
one.
it. I know Stu said he was going to sell some. If CHP didn't sell any, they at least said they were going to.
Yeah.
And I know various other coaches that have done the same thing.
Sure. Sure.
So yeah, I think that was everything that I wanted to cover today on cardio. I think we gave a pretty good overview of different stages of cardio and running and how it can fit into each person's life, and then kind of hit the big hitters on tactical and concurrent athletes. So if you don't have anything else to add, I think we're good there.
I don't, other than maybe next time we can talk about how strength training fits into each of those populations.
I
That'd
was
be
I was thinking
interesting
the same
to.
thing.
Mhm.
That'd be fun. Cool. Well, we'll do that. Maybe we can get Joe on again too, so we can talk about
Oh, yeah.
that. He's super busy. So,
Yeah.
all right, dude. Well, it was good to talk to you. I'll hit you up, and we will get another one of these on the calendar.
Sounds good.
Good deal, dude. See you later. Thank you for listening to today's podcast. If you enjoyed it, it would be helpful if you could leave a rating or a review on whatever platform you're listening on, as that helps us reach more audiences and get more awesome guests on. If you're interested in anything we talked about today, you can check the show notes for all links. Otherwise, I will see you guys in the next podcast.